There is an invisible line on Mount Everest, sitting roughly at 26,000 feet above sea level. Mountaineers call it the death zone. Above this altitude, human life is no longer sustainable. The atmospheric pressure is so low that a breath pulls in only a third of the oxygen available at sea level. The body literally begins to consume itself to survive. Digestive systems shut down. Blood thickens, turning sluggish and prone to clotting. Brain tissue begins to swell, leading to a profound, intoxicating confusion. In the death zone, you are not living, you are slowly dying. The only way to survive is to reach the summit and get back down before the clock runs out. On May 10, 1996, for a group of climbers scattered across the upper reaches of the mountain, that clock simply stopped. To understand how a routine summit push turned into one of the most agonizing fights for survival in modern history, you have to look at the environment of Everest in the mid-90s. The mountain was changing. It was no longer the exclusive domain of elite-sponsored alpinists. Commercial expeditions had arrived, offering wealthy clients the chance to stand on the roof of the world for a fee of around $65,000. Two of the most prominent operations were adventure consultants, led by the meticulous and highly respected New Zealander Rob Hall, and Mountain Madness, guided by the charismatic American climber Scott Fischer. Both men were veterans of the high Himalayas. Both had built reputations on their ability to bring amateur climbers to the summit and back safely. By early May, base camp was a sprawling, colorful village of tents resting on a moving glacier. The atmosphere was a strange mix of high-stakes tension and mundane waiting. Climbers spent weeks acclimatizing, making agonizingly slow trips up and down the lower camps to force their bodies to produce more red blood cells. Among the clients were people from all walks of life. There was Beck Weathers, a pathologist from Texas, Yasuko Namba, a Japanese businesswoman attempting to become the oldest woman to summit, and Doug Hansen, a postal worker from Washington State, who had taken on 2 jobs to afford the trip. Hansen had climbed with Rob Hall the previous year, but was turned around just shy of the summit. Hall felt a deep personal obligation to get him to the top this time. The plan for summit day was standard. Because the journey from Camp 4 on the South Col to the summit and back takes anywhere from 12 to 18 hours, climbers must leave in the dead of night. On May 10, shortly before midnight, the team stepped out of their tents into the freezing darkness. The temperature was well below zero, but the sky was clear. A line of headlamps began to snake slowly up the steep, icy face of the mountain. At this altitude, every step requires a monumental effort of will. Climbers take one step, lean on their ice axes, and take 3 or 4 ragged breaths before taking the next. The first quiet warning signs that the day was unraveling did not come in the form of a sudden disaster, but through a series of small, seemingly manageable delays. When the climbers reached a prominent feature known as the balcony, they discovered that the Sherpas had not yet fixed the safety ropes. This caused a bottleneck. Dozens of climbers stood idle in the freezing wind, burning precious time and bottled oxygen while they waited for the route to be secured. Higher up, at the Hillary Step, a 40-foot wall of rock and ice just below the summit, the same thing happened. The sheer number of climbers on the mountain that day meant that people were forced to wait in line at 28,000 feet. In high-altitude mountaineering, there is a strict, unbreakable rule: the turnaround time. For Rob Hall's team, the absolute deadline to reach the summit and begin descending was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. If you are not at the top by 2, you turn around, no matter how close you are. This rule exists because the descent is far more dangerous than the ascent, and navigating the upper mountain in darkness is a death sentence. But as the afternoon wore on, the combination of hypoxia, exhaustion, and summit fever began to erode rational decision-making. 2 o'clock came and went. Climbers were still pushing upward. Rob Hall, normally a strict enforcer of discipline, made a fatal concession. Doug Hansen, exhausted and moving at a glacial pace, was determined to reach the top. Remembering the heartbreak of the previous year, Hall allowed Hansen to keep climbing well past the turnaround time. They did not reach the summit until nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By then, The bright, clear morning had given way to a darkening horizon. Far below them, the valley was filling with clouds. It is common for afternoon clouds to roll in on Everest, but this was different. The barometric pressure began to plummet. A massive, unpredicted storm system was surging up the mountain. By the time the last climbers began their descent, the storm hit with the force of a freight train. Winds accelerated to hurricane speeds, exceeding 70 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to an estimated 70 degrees below zero. The driving snow created a total whiteout, reducing visibility to zero. The mountain was instantly transformed into an unrecognizable, hostile void. Climbers descending from the summit found themselves completely blind, their headlamps reflecting off a solid wall of flying snow. The wind sounded like a jet engine, making communication impossible, even between people standing just a few feet apart. Scattered across the upper mountain, the situation rapidly deteriorated into chaos. High above, near the Hillary Step, Rob Hall was struggling to get Doug Hansen down. Hansen had completely run out of energy and could no longer stand. Hall refused to leave his client, a decision that trapped them both at 28,700 feet as the blizzard raged around them. Not far below them, Scott Fischer, the leader of the Mountain Madness team, had collapsed. Suffering from severe altitude sickness and sheer physical exhaustion, Fischer ordered his lead guide Anatoly Bukriev to descend without him and help the clients. Fischer tied himself to a snow anchor and sat down in the storm to wait. Further down, on the broad, flat expanse of the South Col, a group of clients and guides had become hopelessly lost. They were somewhere on the same plateau as Camp 4, possibly only a few hundred yards from the safety of their tents. But in the whiteout, they had no idea which direction to walk. If they walked the wrong way, they would step off a sheer drop of several thousand feet. Among this group was Beck Weathers, Yasuko Namba, and several others. With their oxygen bottles running empty and their physical reserves exhausted, the guides made a desperate decision. They instructed the group to form a huddle. They huddled together on the ice, wrapping their arms around each other, letting the snow bury them to block the wind. As the night wore on, the cold began to destroy them. Beck Weathers lost his right glove in the wind. His hand froze solid almost instantly. Hypothermia began to shut down their bodies. At this stage of freezing, the human body stops shivering. The blood retreats from the extremities to protect the vital organs, leading to rapid, irreversible frostbite in the fingers, toes, and face. Eventually, the brain is deprived of oxygen-rich blood, leading to a strange, apathetic drift into unconsciousness. When the storm briefly broke the following morning, the guides who could still walk stumbled into Camp 4 to get help. An expedition doctor and a guide named Stuart Hutchison went out into the howling wind to find the huddled climbers. What they found was a scene of absolute devastation. The climbers were half buried in ice. Yasuko Namba was unresponsive, her eyes dilated, her skin cold and hard. Beck Weathers was buried up to his chest in snow. His face was covered in a thick layer of ice, and his exposed hand was white and frozen solid. Hutchison cleared the ice from Beck's face and tried to wake him. Beck mumbled something incoherent, but his eyes did not focus. Hutchison assessed the situation with the brutal, pragmatic calculus required in the death zone. It takes a massive, coordinated effort of several healthy men to drag one incapacitated person down the mountain. There were barely any healthy people left at Camp 4. Beck and Yasuko were deeply comatose, hours away from death. If the survivors exhausted themselves trying to drag dying people, more lives would be lost. The decision was agonizing, but in the logic of high altitude, it was the only one. They had to leave them behind. They were left for dead. Meanwhile, high up on the south summit, Rob Hall was dying. Doug Hansen had already succumbed to the elements and slipped away in the night. Hall was alone, severely frostbitten, and out of oxygen. His hands were too frozen to clear the ice from his oxygen mask or to manipulate the ropes to descend. Down at base camp, the radio operators managed to patch a satellite call through to Hall's pregnant wife in New Zealand. In a moment of unbearable intimacy broadcast across the mountain's radio frequency, Hall spoke to his wife one last time. His voice was remarkably calm, stripped of panic by the numbing effects of hypoxia and cold. He told her he was reasonably comfortable. He told her not to worry too. Shortly after that call, the radio went silent. Back down on the South Col, late in the afternoon of May 11, something impossible happened. The storm was still raging. Inside the tents of Camp 4, the survivors were huddled in their sleeping bags, traumatized and waiting for an opportunity to flee the mountain. Out on the ice, Beck Weathers woke up. He had been lying in the snow for nearly 24 hours. His body temperature was profoundly low. His right hand was completely rigid, resembling a block of white marble. His face was blackened by severe frostbite, and his eyes were swollen shut. Yet somehow, a deep, primal survival instinct fired in his brain. He later described the sensation as waking up in a warm, comfortable bed, feeling completely at peace, before the slow, horrific realization of his surroundings settled in. Blind, freezing, and entirely alone, Weathers managed to roll over. He forced his frozen joints to bend. He stood up. He had no idea where the camp was. He simply picked a direction and started walking, moving with a stiff, mechanical gait, leaning entirely on the wind to keep him upright. At Camp 4, a climber happened to look out of a tent and saw a figure emerging from the blowing snow. He looked like a mummy, moving with a terrifying, unnatural stiffness. When the climbers rushed out to meet him, they were horrified. Weathers' face was a solid mask of black, dead tissue. His jacket was unzipped, filled with snow. They brought him into a tent, stripped off his frozen clothing, and forced him into a sleeping bag with another climber to share body heat. Even then, they did not expect him to survive the night. But Weathers did not die. The next day, he managed to walk, supported by others, down the treacherous icy slopes to a lower camp. From there, in one of the highest and most dangerous helicopter rescues ever executed, a Nepalese military pilot navigated the thin air to pluck Weathers and another critically injured climber off the mountain. The aftermath of the 1996 Everest disaster forced a brutal reckoning within the mountaineering community. 8 people died during that single storm, including 2 of the most experienced guides in the world. Beck Weathers survived, but at a terrible cost. He underwent multiple surgery, losing his right arm halfway below the elbow, all the fingers on his left hand, and his nose, which had to be entirely reconstructed. The inquiries and investigations that followed parsed every detail of the timeline. They blamed the delays, the fixed ropes, the suddenness of the storm, and the hubris of the commercialization of the mountain. But none of those explanations could fully capture the terrifying reality of what happens to the human mind and body when pushed beyond the limits of earthly biology. Today, Mount Everest remains a popular destination. Every spring, hundreds of people pay exorbitant fees to follow the same route up the South Col. As they clip into the fixed ropes and struggle upward through the thin air, they pass silent reminders of the mountain's absolute indifference to human ambition. The bodies of many who perished in the 1996 storm, including Scott Fischer and Rob Hall, were never brought down. They remain exactly where they fell, frozen perfectly in time. They sit in the eternal cold of the death zone, a lingering testament to a place where rescue is impossible, where the line between life and death is dictated by the weather, and where sometimes survival requires walking away from the dying.